Good morning, everyone. I was thinking a lot about counter hits this morning and how they've become such a prolific part of basic strategy in this game. They've always been a big part of Tekken, but I feel like they are especially important in 7. It might have to do with the fact that movement is a little bit more limited, so you can't just duck out of any given situation. You kind of have to stick around and eat a shit sandwich a lot more of the time, which might make counter hit setups a little bit more powerful. But I was thinking about how you really need to adapt your strategy for counter hits depending on who you're playing against and what level your opponent is, how advanced they are. There are a couple of different layers to this cake, and I sort of want to explain what I mean. So I've just picked two really counter-hitty characters here that I happen to know a bit about to explain and give you my tips on how to strategize around counter hits. So I should just get some basics out of the way. We have players every day, messaging me saying that they bought the game for the first time this week, which is obviously great. But counter hit is when your move connects during the startup animation of the opponent's move, including the frame of impact. Now I'm going to have to start talking about a lot of frame data here. If you are new, that might sound a little bit intimidating and you might not like frame data, but it's super important when you're strategizing with counter hits and when you're defending against them. It might be the move category where frame data is the most important, except maybe for block punishment. So just to illustrate an example of how important specifically the frame data is here, and the fact that the frame of impact is included in the counter hit window, which is a very important thing to note. Let's just give you an example. So I think down forward 1 into some standing force with Katarina here would work. So Katarina's down forward 1 is -1 on block, and her standing 4 is 11 frames to impact, meaning that in this scenario her standing 4 is effectively going to come out at 12 frames. Now, Miguel has a counter hit launcher back 1, which is 11 frames to impact. So if hers is effectively 12 and mine is 11, that means that I should be able to beat her and counter hit launcher every single time with this move in this scenario. So let's see what happens. So you can see here that my back one is going to beat her, even though it's just one tiny frame of difference. It's night and day, because it's the difference between me eating a massive counter hit launch for huge damage or her doing it. So it's really big. And if we just change one frame, so we use Miguel's standing 4, which is a 12 frame move and also very good, by the way, for counter hits. And Katarina's effectively coming out of 12 and I'm coming out of 12. That means that these moves should trade, and because the frame of impact is included in the counter hit window, we should counter hit launch each other in this scenario every time. And you can see that's exactly what happens. So it's really tiny margins that you're talking about when you're doing these counter hit setups, which means that being aware of your frame data just makes them so much more powerful. And I think one of the ways that advanced players reliably beat less advanced players is they just rely a lot on counter hits, because if you know and your opponent doesn't know, then you can basically launch them on demand using counter hits. So I'm going to start talking about, well, actually let's just give you some quick parameters on counter hit frame data overall before we start talking about setups, because I think it might feel intimidating to go into spreadsheets and try and memorize a lot of numbers. I'm just going to give you a rundown on what kind of frame data you're typically looking at with your counter hit. So a counter hit high launcher is usually going to start around 11 frames. Be no faster than 11 frames, maybe 12 and 13, but 11 is usually the fastest frame you'll find them at. And so if you have a counter hit launching high at 11, that's very good. There are counter hit moves that are 10 frames, but they will typically not give you a full launch. They'll just give you some guaranteed damage on the floor. So stuff like forward 2 from Jack and back 1 from Feng. They're more kind of like get off me tools, right, when you're being pressured. But a counter hit high will typically be safe on block, somewhere like -9 on block, so you won't be able to continue your offense, but you also won't have to risk eating a punish a lot of the time, which is really good. If you're talking about counter hit mids, like this down forward 4 from Katarina, you're usually going to find them around the 15 frame mark. This one is 15 frames, by the way, and they're usually really safe on block. So it's kind of like a mid poke. but you're sacrificing a little bit of your frame data for the really dangerous and powerful counter hit launch property. I'm going to mention that one of the best ways of applying these really good sort of 15-ish frame counter hit mid launchers is to deal with lows. It's, for example, something that Bob has to do a lot of the time because Bob doesn't really have a good hop kick. It's slow and it has a very high hitbox, so a lot of stuff actually goes under it despite the fact that it's a mid. And so he will apply his down forward 2, and you can do this with this down forward 4 as well, when your opponent is doing lows, and you can counter hit them, and that's like an alternative to using a hop kick. And it's also safer than using a hop kick. The reason this works out is that you will typically find your fast low pokes around like 16, 17, 18, 19. There are low pokes that are faster for some characters, but if this is 15 and those low pokes are slower, then you're going to counter hit them even if they are crushing highs, which a lot of these low pokes do, and you can get reliable counter hit launchers on lows using these mids, which is really good. And that's the reason, one of the reasons you might use them above, a high, despite the fact that the high is faster. And then your counter hit lows you'll typically find somewhere around 20, 21 frames at the fastest. If they are launchers, they will be launch punishable on block almost always, but they also have high crush properties and really good range. So they're more like you're laying a trip wire, or you're trying to trip up an opponent who's coming in and counter hitting them, or maybe using it for its crush properties, but that's a lot more dangerous, especially offline. So that's just some baseline numbers to carry with you when you're starting to strategize with counter hits if you don't want to read up on a lot of frame data. But definitely look up the frame data on your character and the good counter hit moves that your character has, and carry that with you, because it's going to be really important for you, depending on what character you play. But if it's Miguel or Katarina or like Steve or Kazumi or a character like that, then it's going to be very important for you. Now, let's start talking about the slightly more interesting stuff, which is how to strategize with counter hits and how to set them up. Like I say, this is going to depend on what level you're playing at and how advanced you are. So, for example, or how advanced your opponent is really. But let's give you another example with Katarina here. This is like the oldest trick in the book with her. It's like an ancient setup, and it's just 1-1-2. Into that down forward 4 that I showed you earlier. Now, the reason this works is that the final hit of the 1-1-2 gives her massive advantage on block, and if you don't know that, or you're anxious and you're jittery and you're going to swing here because you blocked something and you think it's your turn, you're going to get counter hit launched every time. And what I'm doing here with Miguel, by the way, is a one jab, which is my fastest move in my entire repertoire, meaning that there's nothing I can do to trade with or interrupt Katarina here. If I swing, I'm always going to get launched. So that might seem like a really good setup for counter hits, and it's going to work really well in lower ranks. It's going to give you a lot of free launches there. It's a real noob slayer in that sense, but it's going to stop working really quickly, because if you're playing against somebody who knows the setup and has seen it, which most players who have played for a while have, because it's common, or know a lot of frame data, they're probably going to do something like this instead. A backdash into a whiff punish. They might even just sidestep out of the way. I think they can do it to both directions in this scenario. I think you can go left as well. Yeah, so it's honestly a pretty dangerous thing to try and apply against somebody who has seen the setup before and knows how to deal with it. And so to set up your counter hits, you're going to have to do something a little bit more subtle if you're playing against somebody who knows their stuff, basically. And I'm going to mention 3 different ways that you can do that. One is with delay catching. It's kind of one that I just want to get out of the way because I don't think it's very useful. It can be, depending on what character you're playing, but something like the down forward 4-1-1 from Miguel, that final hit is delayable and has counter hit properties, and you'll find that this is something that Namco do quite a lot. They'll stick counter hit properties on delayable moves, because you can do this fun thing where you sort of try and tease your opponent to swinging by delaying it and then collecting the counter hit, and it feels great when you're actually able to do this like that and you get a full combo. The reason I say it's ambiguously useful is because strings like that are really telegraphed are easily recognizable by players who have seen them before, and they're just not all that likely to swing. However, if you do have moves or strings that are not as prolific or easy to recognize, like this delayable Savage 3-3 for Miguel. That's a delayable counter hit launcher, and because it's not used by that many Miguel players, you might luck out and get a launch there. But the other good way of doing this is when you have a string that you use a lot, such as your jab string, and then you don't do the counter hit often at all, but you represent the first 2 hits, and then every once in a while you tack on the counter hit and try and catch them there. So say I'm using this down forward 4-1 a lot with Miguel for different purposes, and then just when my opponent's gotten really comfortable with seeing this and recognizing it as a 2-hit affair, I then tack on that final hit and get the counter hit. That's not a great example of this string. It's actually a lot more useful when you're talking about jab strings. And if you think about Shaheen and Brian, for example, they have counter hit extensions to their normal jabs, and if they're representing the jab a lot and then putting the counter hit on there at the end every once in a while, they can actually get good counter hit launches against even good players. So it can definitely work. The characters I play, Bob has 1-2, 1+2, and I basically haven't been able to counter hit anybody with that above like Mighty Ruler. So I've basically just dropped the move out of my repertoire at this point, but I guess it could be useful. Okay, the other 2 ways of using your counter hits that I think are the really good and advanced ways of doing it that will hit even good opponents is, well, the first one is to create more subtle frame traps, not when you're like at +9 or something massive, because you're never going to get an opponent to swing right there. But if you can do slightly more clever stuff, it might work. And I think one way of doing it is by using just 1-jabs. 1-jabs are really great in this game because they give you advantage on both block and hit, and they're normalized across the roster. So you can just remember the frame data of a basic 1-jab, and it will typically be the same no matter what character you play, specifically +1 on block and something like +8 on hit. So if this is going to give me a plus frame on block and I have 11 frame counter hit launchers, then you can see why that might be a powerful setup. So if we record a 1-jab into the standing 4 here for Katarina, and we go back to the example at the start, Miguel did back 1, which is an 11 frame move, right? But if and Katarina's standing 4 is an 11 frame move, so they should trade and launch each other. But if she gets a 1-jab blocked, that one tiny frame of advantage should allow her to beat my back 1 and launch me here. And you can see that it does. So a 1-jab is something that you're going to use a lot, and this is the reason you see a lot of good players set up their offense or start their offense with a 1-jab, because it's kind of a win-win situation. Miguel kind of doesn't, because his 1-jab has such crappy range, but he can. But it's just a really, really good tool for starting offense, and definitely for setting up counter hits. Another one that works really well for Katarina is just down forward 1, because like I mentioned earlier, this down forward 1 has -1 on block, and that's a tiny amount of disadvantage, and it's also something that is kind of exceptionally good. Like a normal down forward 1 like this, you would typically be -2 or more, and even if you're playing against a good opponent, they might not know that down forward 1 is only -1, because it's slightly out of the ordinary. And so you can set up something really good here. And this is a setup that I saw Rong Chu apply on Low High at Damage Germany the other day, and he actually counter hit launched Low High successfully with this setup, specifically down forward 1 into standing 4 on block. And Low High is an extremely good player, but he's also famous for having solid defense and blocking really effectively. So if it works against him, then you know that it's a good setup, right? So Low High was playing Shaheen, so let's think about what can he do when the down forward 1 gets blocked here. What can he swing with that isn't going to get counter hit launched, where he can jab and he can do his own 11 frame counter hit launcher, which is his 4-1. That'll work, but anything else is going to get launched here. And an interesting thing is that the down forward 1 from Shaheen is 13 frames, and so is Miguel. So if I do a down forward 1 here, you can see that if we're just trying to trade with down forward 1s here, you know, she does a down forward 1 block, and I'm going to do one of my own, maybe predicting that he's going to keep on, you know, doing down forward 1s, then I'm going to get counter hit launched. So just a little tiny amount of disadvantage in this case can be an effective frame trap and can really mess with your opponent, but it needs to be small and it needs to be subtle, because big, you know, plus on block moves like this, they're just not going to get you a lot of counter hits when your opponent is playing, you know, effectively, cautiously, defensively, and with knowledge of frame data. Another really good way of using counter hits, and I think this is the one you see with the most powerful counter hits in the game, like forward 4 from Jhin and 3+4 from Brian, is to try and catch your opponent coming in and tripping them up on their way in with some sort of offense. So if you're just watching your opponent when you're in neutral and you're moving and they're trying to come in on you, if you can just be there with a big, you know, counter hit like that and catch them coming in, it can be really effective. You can also use it on the approach, of course, run in and do this, but it requires you to have a really good like feel for when your opponent's going to swing. But you will see that advanced players will do this successfully all the time, and it's really impressive, because think about just moving around like this, you know, looking at your opponent and watching them. Think how many frames are flashing by, you know, 60 frames in every second, but they still manage to find a counter hit window that might be as small as 10 frames and place a move effectively in that window for the counter hit. So that is something that is going to start being easier to do when you're you know, play the game for a lot longer. But if you have one of those great long-range, very safe counter mids like forward 4 from Jhin, literally just stand around and do it. I mean, it's obviously like reductionist thing to say. There's a lot more that goes into that, but if it is very safe and you can use it for keep out, you can honestly just apply it over and over a lot and wait for the counter hit to happen. And if it's low risk, then, you know, it's going to be a launch eventually, but if your opponent isn't going to like move out of the way, you know, very sort of beautifully and with good timing and with punish you for doing it, then you're probably going to be very safe and you can just wait for the counter hit launch to happen, which is, you know, an oppressive way of using counter hits, but it's really effective. So those are the ones that I recommend. You know, look at your mid pokes and look at your jabs and your really effective small pokes and understand, you know, oh, this one is only -2 or this one is +1 right here. That's really interesting. You know, Katarina has this new thing in season 2 where she gets 1 plus frame off of this headbutt on block, for example. That's a weird move that you don't see a lot, and it's a small amount of advantage. That can be really effective for counter hit setups, or try and use him sort of defensively for keep out, especially if they are counter hit lows. And I think you'll see a lot more success in slightly higher ranks. But, you know, if you're still starting out with Tekken, just try and create some of these basic frame traps like 1-1-2 into a counter hit, and you'll probably be surprised by how easily you can get a very powerful launch for a whole lot of damage. I think that's going to wrap up my little discussion on counter hit strategy. I hope it was useful. I think this one was maybe a little bit more geared towards newer players, but I love making videos like that. So I really hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you are enjoying Tekken. I have a lot more stuff on the way, of course, and I'm trying to head for 20k subscribers. Not that, you know, I'm necessarily driven by my need for subscribers or anything. I'd make these videos even if I had, you know, 10. But I have a lot of stuff on the way, and there's going to be a lot of content over the next 2 weeks. So I hope you look forward to that. But for now, thank you so much for watching this one, and I'll see you guys again very soon.